Hi, my name is Tamara Metz, and I was meant to give a live version of this talk this afternoon at the International Social Ontology Conference. And I had a calendar mishap, so I wasn't there. So in lieu of that, I'm going to give you a recorded version of the talk, which will be less exciting for me, but I hope will generate some interest out there. So first, I want to apologize for the mishap, and I want to thank Professor Barzagan Forward for inviting me to share my thoughts with you. And I thought I'd start by just saying a few words about, before I dive into my thoughts about neoliberal family values, I'd just share a few words with you about what I aim to be doing here in a sort of meta way. And that is sort of broadly, I see myself as linking projects of conceptual clarification and normative questions to an analysis of societal tendencies and governing political reason and subject production. So it's more Marx and Foucault, or really Fraser and Brown, than Rawls, which is to say, it's more the socialist feminist in history Oken than it is the analytical philosopher Oken. Okay, so I wanted to start with an observation, which is democracy in the United States. By many accounts, it's in shambles, it's on the brink. Our politics are so polarized that some experts wonder if our democracy is going to survive the coming midterms. And indeed, many question whether we should even call ourselves a democracy at this moment. We're radically polarized, and yet, by the sound of it, we seem to agree big time on one thing, which is the importance of the family. So the family animates everything from immigration debates to health insurance and tax policy. Families are the rhetorical darlings of politicians from Bernie Sanders to Donald Trump. And of course, the family is a very visible center of Joe Biden's response to the devastation brought by the coronavirus pandemic. Indeed, even feminists and many in the LGBTQ communities in recent decades have joined the choir in praise of the marital family. Of course, none of this is to say that there's real agreement on the substance, but still the consensus on the primacy of the family, the importance of the family to public policy, remains as undeniable as it is remarkable. This convergence is notable for more than just apparent cross-partisan support. It stands out because it seems to conflict with what many would describe as the core ethos of the dominant political rationality of the last 50 years, that colonizes everything from the soul to the state by free market mechanisms and values. So why? My question is, why is the family so prominent precisely at this moment? And I would say a family of what sort is prominent at this moment in these ways? And what I propose, or I hope to show in some way, is that the private, responsibilized, care for one's own family serves essential ideological and material functions of assuming responsibility for dependency care, which is sort of the kind of care that's typically associated with families, to social reproductive labor more broadly. and here I'm quoting Nancy Fraser, socializing the young, building communities, reproducing shared meanings, effective dispositions, and horizons of value that underpin social cooperation. This family takes this labor off of the public register discussion and off of the public ledger. And in so doing, it bolsters the neoliberal fantasy of the autonomous, utterly independent individual and family, and obscures our complex, nested social interdependence with other humans and vibrant matter. It feeding this fantasy and making it work just enough for just enough of the right people. The centrality of the family feeds or fuels a tendency to turn away from democratic engagement. It saps society, and therefore I want to suggest, or I worry, it fertilizes the ground for tyranny. Okay, so I've been told that neoliberalism is a concept better left in the trash can, and I get it, but after thinking about it for a long time, I actually think it's a useful concept because it connects things, it connects phenomena that we might not see as connected, that are appropriately connected, and I think properly defined, it can be really useful. So I use neoliberalism to refer to the dominant political economic formation or institutionalized social order and attendant rationality of the last 50 years. And what I focus or draw my examples primarily from the US, this is a force that is really, it's a global force or a global entity. It's useful, I think, to think about neoliberalism as having distinct but thoroughly imbricated co-constituting dimensions, specifically neoliberal political economy on the one hand and neoliberal political rationality on the other. And these are two dimensions that I think are most insightfully analyzed by neo-Marxists and neo-Foucauldians, both with a feminist bent. So neo-Marxists tend to, they start with the assumption or claim that we live in a capitalist social formation, and therefore that profit or the accumulation of surplus value is a fundamental drive that colors everything in our society. They tend to see neoliberalism as a global capitalist project and understand neoliberal capitalism as unembedded or unrestrained financialized capitalism, unrestrained by public policies or political movements, characterized by increased precarity for all but the 1%, especially along lines of race, class, gender, and national status. And they also note an increased reliance on private, paid or unpaid, sources of care. They point to neoliberal policies like deregulation, privatization, restraint on labor, and tax and tariff policies that are friendly to foreign direct investment. And in general, a kind of financialization of public and economic life. Some of the key institutions in this view of this, of course, all capitalist societies contain workers and owners and producers, and social reproductive labor is always an externality ready, available for exploitation or expropriation, depending on how you look at it. In the neoliberal context, the social reproductive order is built on is built on, it is a story of the movement of white middle and upper class women being forced by falling wages, so the death of the family wage, and also encouraged by the growth of a kind of feminism to move into the paid labor force. And simultaneously, the movement not being met, there was no parallel increase in public support for the social reproductive labor that they were doing. Indeed, the reverse. The result is what we have now, which is that the financialized capitalist regime is, and this is Nancy Fraser again, squeezing social reproduction to a breaking point. And I would say that the sense that it's squeezing social reproductive labor to the breaking point is especially a new sensation for white middle and upper class women. I think it's important to note that many people, Black, brown, non-citizens, and poor, have been experiencing this squeeze for a long time under American liberal capitalism. So Neo-Foucauldians emphasize or focus on what they call the political rationality of an era. And the political rationality is the logic or the way of thinking and speaking. It's the values, the coordinates, the, quote, saturating reality principles governing every sphere of existence. This is Wendy Brown. That conduct conduct. That's Foucault. So the key features of neoliberal political rationality on Brown's account, and I follow her here, are markets and morals as the foundations of freedom. Markets and morals and nothing in between. And the spirit of this rationality is best captured by Margaret Thatcher and her famous quip that, quote, "There's no such thing as society. There are only individual men and women, and there are families." So the subject here, the individual subject, is kind of the paradigm is the figure of the human capitalist, the free chooser. Every one of us is a capitalist. We're all equal, in theory, of course. It's not a concrete or a practical equality. Rather, it's a formal, political, moral equality, one that explains inequality itself, right, as the result of free choices by autonomous agents. And the family, and I'll elaborate on this shortly, is what I'm going to call well, I've got a bunch of names for it. You'll see I'm kind of searching for the best one, but following Kim Tallbear, you might call it the solo family. Following Joan Toronto, I think you might call it the care for one's own family. You might highlight that it is a possessive family, following an argument I'll make about John Locke. But this is the family that animates the neoliberal political rationality. And the society that neoliberals, from Hayek to Thatcher to Clinton to Trump and his daughter Ivanka reject, is the place, and this is it's the place where we experienced linked fates across our differences and separatenesses. It's sort of conceptually located between the state and personal life. And it's the space, and here I'm paraphrasing Wendy Brown, but it's the space where citizens of vastly unequal and different backgrounds and resources potentially are brought together and thought together. Okay, so the fundamental problem with the neoliberal story is that it denies the fact that we are interdependent beings. Living, not to say anything of living well, is not a solo endeavor. It depends on giving, receiving, taking, and sharing care, broadly defined. And further, care is always nested. No individual can care for themselves in isolation. No individual caregiver gives care without the support of others. No family without the support from beyond. And of course, contra Aristotle, not even the polis is wholly self-sufficient. Humans and the rest of vibrant matter are thoroughly interdependent. So we can call these the facts of care. What I propose is that neoliberalism depends on, constructs in material and ideological ways the responsibilized private care providing and property holding marital solo family. This figure and this institution serves neoliberalism by hiding the costs of care, which are themselves reflect our utter and always deep interdependence, versus the fantasy of an autonomous being. They reflect the fact that we are not born, as Locke proposes, naturally free and equal. This figure serves neoliberalism by hiding the systematic inequalities associated with giving, receiving, giving and receiving care by taking it off the public ledger and out of public discussion. Okay, so neoliberal familialism is not liberal familialism, but they are, I think, genetically related. And I think it can be easier for us to see what is hidden under our own common sense by looking backwards at our distant and less common sense genes. So we're going to take a brief detour into Locke. And so Locke is in many respects, a proto-neoliberal thinker. That's, I think, redundant, but he's a darling of key neoliberal thinkers like Friedrich Hayek and others. So what we see in stark relief in Locke is that the subject whose inalienable rights government is entrusted to protect carries with him, almost on the sly, but not quite, not if you're reading chapter 5 of the second treatise carefully, he carries with him three important things. And they are, as I said, almost on the sly. He carries with him unequal private property. Second, he carries a private marital family, which, like property, includes servants, the fruits of whose labor the husband or family, and Locke probably is fairly described as the confused man's Hobbes. He's a little unclear on this. So he carries with him a private marital family that is both the site and source of care and of private property via inheritance, the defense of which is one of government's key roles. And third, this individual, that the Locke's government is set to protect, carries with him endless natural resources. For Locke, the natural world is an endless resource only made valuable by individuals, of course, who mix their labor with it and improve its value and improve its value by privatizing it. The connection here to those whose lands his writings and thought helped steal is made clear, right? When he says, "In the beginning, all the world was America." For Locke, the private property holding, monogamous, heteropatriarchal family is an autonomous, self-sufficient entity. For him, the private family arises in the state of nature, out of the procreative urge, and stays in existence as a result of the other key invention of nature, that is, private property. The private family holds and transfers private property, more precisely marriage, which Tallbear rightly calls solo marriage because of the way it ties monogamy and private property together. So marriage, which for Locke founds the private property, private family, and money, which for Locke justifies unequal private property holdings, are simultaneously products of nature and consent. In other words, consent confirms natural imperatives. And while marriage and money both merge and emerge spontaneously in the state of nature, it is a key purpose of civil government to recognize and regulate both in their union. Now, typically, and for good reason, Locke is seen as prioritizing the individual and consent. In fact, however, Locke's individual is inextricably linked to, as in attached to, embedded in, and sustained by an apparently autonomous private property holding family. Now, Marxist critics, such as C.B. McPherson, have famously described Locke's theory as one of possessive individualism. Possessive familialism might be more apt. The private property funneling and private care providing marital family, recognized and regulated by the state, is a necessary element of Locke's limited government liberalism, a liberalism that is structured to support the then emerging capitalist economy. So this isolated, self-caring family, intimately tied to the account of the natural right to property and consent to inequality it endorses, it turns out is at the very root of liberal thinking. It's no surprise then that in 1987, the prime minister of Locke's native country would proclaim that there is no such thing as society, only individuals and families. This view of things is deep in the liberal DNA. Okay, let me turn off my text ringer. Sorry about that. So too, I want to argue, is this true in the newest version of liberalism? Now more than ever, the private families are affirmed as responsible for securing great swaths of essential and costly social reproductive labor, responsible for the production and well-being of consumer citizens as a wholly private matter, shunting the real costs and benefit of this work from public attention and from the public ledger. Now, this is evident, I think, in some really surprising places. One of my favorite sets of examples comes from mainstream feminist voices in the last decade or so. But I'm going to say a few words about same-sex marriage and the particular way in which it draws on and furthers a vision of the marital family as the entity responsible for the provision of care. So I would argue that an essential part of the story of the remarkable meteoric rise and acceptance of same-sex marriage is the rise of the logic of neoliberal politics of care itself. So same-sex marriage gained legal recognition only after it was rebranded in ways that tapped into broader trends of what that cast marriage as at once a free and private choice and as the site of responsible for care, hence a choice that no rational actor could refuse. This version of same-sex marriage is related to the version of family that has been deployed by a politics that, quote, responsibilizes freedom, where you're free to take care of yourself, and here I'm quoting David Scott, or crucially, as Joan Toronto puts it, care for one's own. In other words, this is a politics that demands that of you, and this is a version of the family that fits that. So, for instance, Justice Kennedy's paean to marriage stresses both that it is a private choice and that it is that source that it secures individuals against the vagaries of life and loneliness by tying them to each other. And thus, at its core, Obergefell resonates with this keynote in the chorus of neoliberal familialism. Obergefell, of course, cast marriage's net of legitimation and responsibilization wider. The decision welcomes a new group, gays and lesbians, into the fold, ostensibly decoupling the distribution of social reproductive labor from its previous heteropatriarchal norms and forms. In fact, though, the decision altered very little about in the fundamental function and form of marriage in the family that marriage marks as privileged. It ties responsibility for the provision of now more costly and risky care to a hyper-sentimentalized, amorous, and quasi-religious and socially conservative amata-normative, to quote Elizabeth Brake, sexually, economically, and socially contained unit of one's own, even as the demands of the neoliberal political economy mean that the provision of care is intimately linked to intensified race, class, national status, and gendered inequalities. In this way, Obergefell reflects and extends a time-tested strategy of liberal capitalism to simultaneously secure and obscure the real costs and unequal benefits and burdens of care, those labors and good upon which common life depends, but which neither capitalism nor neoliberal politics incorporates fully and equally. And it does so by sentimentalizing the private family and making it responsible for those costs. Neoliberal marriage aligns citizens' expectations with the state's disinvestment from social welfare by encouraging people to embrace responsibility for themselves and their increasingly isolated families. The cunning of this history is that this battle in the larger struggle for gay and lesbian civil rights advances a rationality that conflicts in significant ways with our commitments to real freedom and equality for all. Okay, so I would just want to turn to a couple of examples of how this vision of the family, how we see it in some more contemporary examples and contemporary politics. And then I have so the solo family was and continues to be at the center of the national response to the coronavirus pandemic. And I should just say that maybe parenthetically, maybe it's best to describe the marital family as the magnetic core of the neoliberal vision of family, even as alternative family forms are certainly being accepted to a greater extent. But they're only accepted insofar as they mirror or mimic the chosen, private, solo, propertied, and wealth funneling, responsibilized care for one's own family. This family is framed as the only chosen responsible, the only responsible. This family is framed as the public response to human dependency, It's the only one that gets the job done via choice and without society. Solo units with their private property and responsibility to care for their own. Okay, so the solo family was and continues to be at the center of the national response to the coronavirus pandemic. So 2 quick examples. One, of course, is the shelter in place. As stay-at-home orders and school closures that were at the core of the response, they all assumed that unaided families would, could, and should provide essential services and care for their members, and that if they did so, everything would be well enough. So common sense, this is so common sense that one might not even notice, unless, of course, notice that it is not necessary, not a necessary response, unless, of course, you happen to be one of those folks not embedded in something that approximates the group the policy assumes, or actually come to think of it, even if you are so embedded, and especially if you happen to be one of those people designated as responsible for providing that care and service, you may also have noticed, seen with new clarity, how much responsibility the family is assigned in our society as the paltry supports melted away under the tidal wave of the pandemic. Without schools and playdates and parks and elder care and access to extended care networks, families, neighbors, grandparents, friends, the real significance of these burdens became painfully clear. So in short, the family as public policy, as a key site of essential care, giving and receiving, was at this aspect of the official response to the pandemic. And ditto in Biden's more long-term response, his Build Back Better plan. The same family, the private, chosen, sentimental, responsible family, is at the heart of this plan. It's got 2 pieces. The first is the American Rescue Plan, which is focused on immediate relief, economic relief for schools and businesses and so forth, and individuals. And the second is the American Families Plan. The press release describes it as an investment in our kids, our families, and our economic futures. Along with the American Rescue Plan, they go on to say will reinvest in the future of the American economy and American workers, and will help us outcompete China and other countries around the world. In other words, families are about kids, about care of one's own, and about economic prosperity. So the family is the figure at the center of our national response to these health, economic, and political crises. Now, for all of this apparent love, the importance of the family, would almost everyone, save perhaps for the 2%, the 1%, experienced vividly as the shelter-in-place orders rolled across communities last spring, is that the family was not up to the responsibilities that was foisted upon it. As social networks were rent, social support from public schools, private food pantries, cultural institutions, bowling leagues, and soccer clubs fell away, as paid caregivers stayed home, at least until the dire need or offers they couldn't refuse came in from wealthier employers and families. The shelter in place exposed what many already knew, but didn't quite have a publicly recognized language or idiom to describe, that the family celebrated in so many corners was a cruel fantasy. The normative, solo, nuclear, marital, private property holding and funneling, responsible for care of its own family, was neither possible nor desirable. The nuclear family, it turns out, never was self-sufficient. It never was the private entity we envisioned. All families, units of primary intimate care giving, are radically dependent, nested in networks of support, some of it material, some of it social, some of it paid, much of it unpaid. Government policies on tax, education, health, and immigration structure and resource or fail to resource our families, and forces of gender and race, as well as national status and geopolitical location, shape the institution, material and mythical, of the family. Under shelter in place, solo families were suddenly made genuinely so, or almost genuinely so. And oh, what an experiment it was. Not only were families unable to live up to their utter autonomy, but we saw all the ways that even if they had succeeded in caring for their own, the social reproductive labor needed to keep society, any society, going would not have been forthcoming. Societies depend on more, not just the individuals who don't inhabit something that looks like the gold standard of this mythical family, but all the myriad connections and interdependencies that sustain units of intimate care and that sustain cross-cutting communities. So Aristotle was right that the family is not self-sufficient, but he stopped too soon by imagining that even the polis was. I propose that what we saw here this last year, what was laid bare, is the ruse of the neoliberal vision of a world made up only of individuals and families, a world without society in which individual choosers and private property holders contract, compete, and work to increase their human capital, all with the support only of autonomous, solo, nuclear, marital, private property holding and funneling, responsible for one's own care, families. So, to return to my opening question, what, if anything, does the figure and the institution of the neoliberal family, its place and its function in the wider neoliberal project, have to do with our ailing democracy? I've got 3 or 4 hypotheses or emerging arguments that probably need to be fleshed out a bit more, but I'd love to hear what you have to say, think about these things. So first, as I said, so I've made this argument that this figure and institution of the family takes the full real costs of living, of social life, off of the public register and ledger. And in doing this, I would suggest that it starves society, starves the society upon which democracy depends. It fuels a fantasy that individuals and families survive, even thrive in a vacuum, that they exist independent of the connective tissues and cross-cutting, overlapping nests of society and beyond. It fuels the fantasy that we can live without these things. It leaves us without a full vocabulary to describe these things. And in doing so, it saps them in practice of life. Further, in very concrete terms, the political economic structure and forces fed by this fantasy family leave most people, the vast majority, with less and less time, energy, or attention to give to the social world in which we are nested and upon which we depend. But as thinkers from Aristotle to Rousseau to Tocqueville to Arendt, even Locke in his sensible moments, and to my local favorites, Fraser, Brown, and Toronto, as they have argued, democratic politics depends on the existence of something, society, a people, a demos, between the individual and their family, and the individual, the family, and their state. In the absence of this admittedly elusive and changing entity or space, the already powerful, in our world, the rich, will rule. Second, or further, as we've seen, the fantasy of the solo care for one's own family is accomplished, such as it is, only through structures of inequality. It relies on and feeds hierarchies of gender, race, and class, and crucially, national status to eke out a plausible existence. Now, many, perhaps most, theorists of democracy in the Western tradition have been of two minds, or simply from our or my perspective, incoherent on this point. Aristotle, for instance, and Rousseau and Tocqueville in their ways, insist that ideal democracy, which Aristotle calls aristocracy, depends not only on formal equality, but on a kind of social equality among the active members of the polis, and upon grave inequality and unfreedom between them and those who care for the world they inhabit. But if we accept the insight about the importance of equality to democratic politics, and contra Aristotle, but with our contemporary values, insist that it extend to all, then we see how neoliberal familialism and the structures of inequality upon which it relies and which it feeds threatens democracy. And there's a longer comment. I need to say something about global inequality, but for the sake of time, I'm going to skip it, and would happily have a conversation with anyone interested in the future. My third point here is that in the shadow of the recent Code Red for Humanity UN climate report, and in light of work by Indigenous scholars on the connection between the marital family and the simultaneous decimation of Indigenous social life and of the environment, I can't resist pointing out the role of the dominance of the neoliberal family has had in fueling climate change, which of course is very bad, dare I say, existentially bad for democracy. Specifically, to extend Kim Tallbear and others' insights about the connection between the solo family, the figure and institution, and the fantasy that what I do with my private property matters only to me and my family. Indeed, that I must squeeze my private property for all it's worth because I am solely responsible for the care of my own, and in a capitalist order, accumulate I must. It seems quite clear that possessive familialism fuels the collective action problem that leads to our Code Red climate situation. So in conclusion, neoliberal familialism in its figure and form starves the imagination, the vocabulary, the institutions, and the actual existing social life upon which democratic political life depends. If the full demands of care, the true expanse and value of social reproductive labor broadly understood, are to be brought into the light of the public sphere and onto the public register and the shared ledger, it seems clear that we will have to dislodge the fantasy of the solo, possessive, responsible family. So those are my thoughts. And thanks for listening. I would love to continue this conversation via chat or email. You can contact me at tmetz@reed.edu. Thank you.